Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to explore imperialism, especially the US entry into imperialism. First off, we've got these justifications. We've already seen these in the documents you've read and in the text. And so I did just want to emphasize one or two pieces here. First of all, the issue of missionaries kind of being tied into imperialism is a real problem because in some countries, Christianity gets really associated with imperialism and the conquest. And so Christianity can be seen as the religion of the foreigners, of the people who are oppressing you. That is never a good thing. Even if the missionaries are fighting for better rights for the indigenous populations and things, after decolonization, sometimes those who are Christian are seen as those who've kind of betrayed the cause or who've allied with those who oppressed people. The other issue I just want to emphasize is the difference between kind of civilizing people and social Darwinism. So as you read in some of the documents, the argument from Europe and even the United States is the need for the more advanced civilizations to come in and to help to allow the natives to grow up, to be civilized. And once they're civilized, of course, they won't need to have foreign control, supposedly. But of course, it's always the foreign control, the mother countries that decide when that will happen. Now, that's a very paternalistic approach to imperialism. The natives are like children, and they don't understand what's good for them. And so, thank goodness, here come the British to bring in British culture and make sure everyone drinks tea and plays cricket. Social Darwinism is even more destructive. So, I'm not saying paternalism is good. It's very racist and horrible. But remember, social Darwinism argues that some racial groups are more evolved than others, and especially, of course, whites are the most evolved. Now, that means that the people in the colonies are never actually going to grow up. I mean, they were going to match the Western advanced European cultures because of the fact that the whites will continue to evolve and the blacks will never catch up, or whatever minority group you're dealing with. So in that sense, it's survival of the fittest. And so while paternalism is awful and has a lot of exploitation, at least there's a sense that these are people and they may eventually not need foreign control. With social Darwinism and survival of the fittest, then we're in a race for resources. And really the survival should be only of the fittest population. And certainly we're going to see horrific exploitation and things happening. Because once you determine that a people is subhuman or not as evolved, then you can justify horrible actions against them. So just know that while paternalism's, the civilizing approach is very exploitive and awful, social Darwinism can lead to even worse. And of course, in the 20th century, we're going to see that happen. Okay. U.S. imperialism. I wanted to focus here in this video on the U.S. You'll be reading about some imperialism by the British and French in your textbook. So let's talk about the U.S. coming in to really be a major imperialist power as well. So the best way to understand this is at the end of the 19th century, there are revolts in Cuba and Puerto Rico against Spain. Spain still holds these. It's the last of their colonial empire. And so the U.S. is supporting the independence of these regions. In part, that is the idea that Latin America is under our control, and so we want to be there. But we are supporting independence, and we're supporting independence. And so we actually go to war against Spain. Now, this is pretty trumped up through the newspapers. There's an explosion of a U.S. ship in the port of Havana, Cuba, and the newspapers really start pushing the idea that this was actually Spain attacking America. It actually was just a mistake. I mean, it was an accident, but that doesn't matter. We went to war. And we went to war to support the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico. The war only lasts 4 months. It's very brief, and the Treaty of Paris is signed. Now, this is important. This is when we're really shifting, the United States shifts into a colonial mindset or an imperialist mindset. So first of all, Cuba gets independence, but the U.S. forces Cuba to add an amendment to their constitution that says that the U.S. has the right to interfere whenever we think we need to. So the U.S. is going to be able legally to come into Cuba and to land troops and to do what it thinks it needs to do. The United States also gets Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico will not be on a path to become a state. It is a territory the United States will control, and they'll control it without giving the people in Puerto Rico citizenship rights at first. We also get Guam, another territory will hold just a protectorate, and the Philippine Islands. And in fact, in Philippines, they've been rising against Spain, so they've been in a war of independence against Spain, and they just see the U.S. occupation as continuing that. The U.S. will see this as an uprising against us, but we do have the Philippine War, as you can see there, from 1899 to 1902. This is very devastating. There's estimates that over 100,000 people in the Philippines die, some from starvation and things. The U.S. loses 4,200 troops. But it's a significant issue. And once we capture the Philippines, once we put down the revolt, then that means there's another territory that we're going to control. Now, the status of the people in these new territories, in Guam, in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, and other territories, is up for debate. Now that the U.S. controls these, are these like the Oregon Territory and things like that, which would mean these people would become U.S. citizens, and the U.S. would control these now as territories that would eventually become states. So in the early 20th century, 1900, 1901, 1902, there's a series of cases that go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that in these territories, the people are not fully under the U.S. Constitution. So the U.S. has the right to kind of separate the people that are being ruled by the United States between those who are citizens and in territories that will become states, like Alaska, or the people who are in our protectorates. And the people in those are not going to have citizenship rights. They will not be fully protected by the U.S. Constitution. That is new. The U.S. has always been expansionist. We've been conquering all the time. And of course, there is the issue with the Native Americans. We've talked about that and their status and rights in terms of what's happening. But this is us conquering territory kind of even in a wider range, with the idea that these people will not be on a track to statehood or citizenship. Now, in the 20th century, that will change a little bit and we'll get some rights. So, of course, Puerto Rico, there's still a huge debate about Puerto Rico and should it be the 51st state. So these things continue on, but at least legally now it's been established in the early 20th century that the citizens of these territories are not independent and they are not granted full U.S. citizenship. Now, at the same time, the late 19th century, we do come into Hawaii. Now, the U.S. had a lot of business issues in Hawaii. A lot of U.S. planters are there. And they don't want the Hawaiian monarchy to be successful. So in 1893, the U.S. helps to overthrow the monarchy. And then in 1898, actually in the middle of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. Congress passes the bills that annex Hawaii into the United States, although they potentially are on a path to citizenship. So their standing is different than Puerto Rico or the Philippines. Another area that the U.S. is becoming involved in is China. So now Britain has been and France and many countries have been involved in China. But as the U.S. conquers territory, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, we're really seeing China as potentially a major market for U.S. goods. And we're worried that we're kind of late into China. Now, in 1895, there's a war between China and Japan, as you can see there. And Japan is going to win. And this really helps to show how weak the Chinese military is. And there begins to be a real scattering of trying to get territory in China by the European powers. And so what the U.S. proposes is the open door policy. Nobody gets to like take territory in China. Everybody gets to freely trade, which is of course to our advantage because we want to make sure that we can be able to be involved in China for US business interests. We're already involved a bit with Japan as well, but you'll see that in a different set of readings. Now, the people of China are not particularly excited by the fact that all of these foreign goods are pouring in. The country's not allowed to put high tariffs on these, and it's destroying the economy and also Chinese culture as far as many people in China are concerned. And so in 1899, there's a group of people who rise against foreign control in the Boxer Rebellion. It's not everybody, but in the Boxer Rebellion, there are foreigners who are killed because this whole rebellion is a pushback against foreign interference in China. And so to put this down, there's an 8-nation group that sends troops into China to crush the rebellion. So it's an invasion into China. And as you can see in the list, there's a large number of states that participate, including the US. So this is also right at the same time period. So basically between about 1888 and 1899, now we have territories in the Caribbean. We've taken Guam, Philippines, Hawaii, and we have our interests in China. So this is really the US kind of entering into imperialism as well. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is the fact that this is controversial. So I did just want to talk about it. There are anti-imperialist leagues, so groups in the US which say this is not right. Some of them say the US should not be a colonial or imperialist power because we have this idea that all men are created equal. We've always argued for, no taxation without representation, we believe in national self-determination. And if you were to ask the people in the Philippines if they want to be under US control, the answer would be no. No, we do not. And so clearly we're not following national self-determination there. Now, there's actually anti-imperialist leagues that are also quite racist because they argue that if we have these colonies, it opens the door for people in the Philippines to come to the US. We're kind of opening the door to potentially unsavory elements. So just know that the anti-imperialist leagues themselves are split between people who are more seeing this as a social justice issue and others who are seeing this as possible immigration issue. Now, in the midst of all of this, we're going to get the U.S. will elect Theodore Roosevelt as president, and he'll come into office in 1901. Now, he is going to issue a very important policy. It's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, as you remember, or hopefully remember, the Monroe Doctrine says the U.S. gets to deal with the Western Hemisphere and the European powers are not supposed to interfere. In the Roosevelt Corollary, this basically is a reinforcement of this. It all happens in Venezuela. Venezuela was collapsing. A lot of European banks had made loans. And so there was the fear that European powers would come into Venezuela in order to help these banks get their money. And that isn't what the U.S. wanted. So what the U.S. argues, what Roosevelt says is going to be the new U.S. policy, is that we, the U.S., are going to exercise international police power in Latin America. So this gives us the right to come into any country in Latin America in order to ensure stability and that their government is functioning well enough that the European powers have no reason to come in. And this will be the major justification for U.S. interference in a number of European countries for a while to come. So the idea, this kind of debate that you hear in the U.S. sometimes about whether we should be the world's policeman, well, in 1904, this was officially declared that we were, or at least the U.S. was when it came to Latin America. So know that we're very much coming involved in all of this. One thing I do want to mention before I forget is that within all of this, you don't see settlement. This is what's different between imperialism in this period and earlier colonialism, when you actually had lots of people leave Britain and come to the 13 colonies. This is really the idea that we need these territories for business and political interest because every country that's an important country has colony or has imperial control over territories, and so we're going to do that. So it is a little bit different, but certainly here comes the US into the race for foreign and colonial control.